Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Cove Podcast. For this episode, we're doing a second part to the Timor in World War II episode. In the last episode, we've got a commando company who's dug in on the airfield at Dili, just one section there, and then the remainder of the company is up in the hills, getting ready to mount a guerrilla campaign against a Japanese landing force. We have the 2nd 40th Infantry Battalion dug in at Kupang in West Timor, and the Portuguese have just arrived. Now, I'm joined again by my guest, MAJ Guy Warnock. He just returned from years in the Defence Corporation program in Timor-Leste, living and breathing Dili and Timor itself. He also was one of the Special Air Service Regiment operators that deployed into Timor on INTERFET. So he gave 2 episodes ago an amazing account of what it felt like going himself into Dili and Timor. Welcome again, sir.
Hi, Todd.
So that's where we landed on the last episode. Portuguese have just arrived. We're relieved. You talked about the Dutch having to walk on foot, GP Express back to the border and then cross back into Dutch-held Timor. I think that's an awesome place to. So I suppose now we're all relieved and it's absolutely awesome. We're good to go.
Yeah, it's pretty much that was the mindset. People had this optimism bias that the Portuguese were coming. The Portuguese had sent an infantry battalion on transport ships from Mozambique. They were sailing across the Indian Ocean, and when that security task of their own territory in Portuguese Timor was fulfilled, the Australians and the Dutch would return to across the border into West Timor and therefore Dutch territory. And the idea was that they then marry back up with the Sparrow Force proper and the main, be retasked. And you might remember also that the Australian commandos only had one truck, one serviceable truck, and that truck was used for everything. It was used for pickup rations, it was used to transport heavy equipment, and the Australians had cached their ammunition at sort of the foothills, I suppose, hadn't gone up the mountains, but they cached an enormous amount of explosives, like tons and tons of ammunition, grenades, explosives, all the sort of things that you think commandos might have in World War II. They were then had to have a plan to get out of there. They weren't sure they were going to get a ship back to Kupang. Shipping was quite valuable at the time and also prone to air attack. And Darwin was the main supply link. So supplies were still coming from Darwin in that sort of period, early February, mid-February 1942. So that's sort of what we were at the moment. And, of course, what many soldiers on Sparrow Force up in these remote areas in their sections, their 18-man sections, their 48 or 50-man platoons was led by captains, sections led by lieutenants, they didn't know what was going on. They were literally using messengers, people walking backwards and forwards between each of the posts, passing on handwritten messages about what was going on. None of them knew that Singapore was about to fall.
And so had Darwin been bombed at this point? I suppose the Portuguese arrived, what we think is the Portuguese arrived in Dili. Has Darwin's already been bombed at this point, is that correct?
So the sole reason the Japanese attacked Darwin when they did was to enable the invasion of Timor, Kupang and Dili, Portuguese and Dutch territory. So the date, the timing, everything, the force that was assembled, the purpose, everything was to enable the Japanese to land in Dili and Kupang. And they did. So Darwin is bombed by carrier-based aircraft, strafed, Val dive bombers, Zero fighters, the same force effectively that bombed Pearl Harbor from the same aircraft carriers in the morning. And then bombers from Ambon, land-based Betty bombers, then give them another pasting a few hours later. And different objectives, the town itself, and as mentioned in the previous episodes with Lieutenant Colonel Steve Young, Australia's Pearl Harbor effectively. And it was devastating because in that harbour was some vessels that only a week earlier, less than a week earlier, had on their way to Timor been turned around by air attack. USS Perry, which was lost in the attack on Darwin, was attacked taking supplies and escorting a convoy to Timor. Some of those items were bound for the independent companies, including some of the heavy weapons and their extra trucks and signals equipment and some personnel. They were forced to turn around and go back to Darwin. So when you think about it now and you look at it, it sort of looks like writing's on the wall, The distance between Dili and Darwin is not very far. So to have a convoy attacked on the way out of Darwin towards Dili or towards Timor would suggest that the Japanese are within striking range of Darwin itself, and everyone was on high alert. But even so, as we heard from the episode about Australia's Pearl Harbor, it seemed that the Japanese were able to get largely there, and that optimism bias of people thinking that's a lot of American aircraft getting their way to Darwin today, even though they don't look like American aircraft, and Basically, we all talked ourselves out of it, and that is the situation that we find ourselves in Dili. The Australians coming down the hill in their truck, they see the Portuguese ships in the harbour. They all congratulate themselves. Finally, we're out of here. They all talk about it. They all say, the survivors in their diaries, all we could think about was, oh, great, we'll be able to go back to our mates and we'll be able to go back to, the real war, not this sort of babysitting a neutral territory. Now, during the night, there's number 2 section under Jerry Mackenzie is at the airfield, and they hear the noises that they said, like chains and machinery. So he sends off a patrol. Lieutenant Mackenzie sends off a patrol with Corporal Kev Curran and a few diggers. So they go down to the water edge and turn left if you're in Dili, if you can imagine, if you've got a map in front of you. And they go along the coast and they come back and they say, their Japs are right. The Japanese had landed sort of, if you know Dili, between the port, I guess, and around the corner to the mouth of the Comoros River. They put some ships down. There's another part of the story which I won't cover now, which will come out later, but there's a reason why they went a bit further away from town. They really wanted to land right in front of the runways. Now, again, another factor that I didn't know until only probably a couple of years ago, was the Dutch had machine guns covering the airfield, like the approaches on the beach. So all that beach was covered by those Vickers-style machine, those Maximum machine guns on tripods or on carts. And big sections too. They had like 9 sections for one machine gun. So like all the ammo, everything was carried, so it was native machine gunners. But I believe the actual gunners were Dutchmen. So well trained and well versed. And those 2 artillery pieces I talked about, these are like old guns. And you look at them and they're like, you think that's the sort of thing you see at the front of Vic Barracks. And they were out the front of the Dutch Military College in Batavia, which is now Jakarta. And the Dutch took them down, found ammo for them and repurposed them. And of course they didn't give the best. So the Dutch had some good artillery, some locally made and some Krupp, some German stuff made in the 1930s, not World War II cast-offs. But when they sent that force to Portuguese Timor, they didn't send their best artillery to defend Portuguese territory. They just sent these 2 gate guards with the guns, and they sent them under Captain De Winter. Captain De Winter, I'd like to think was an older gentleman, passed over for promotion, bitter, twisted, sent out to the colonies. He wanted a sweet gig in Amsterdam, and he got the boob job. Not only to go to the colonies, but then he got sent out to Portuguese Timor. Not even defending his own territory.
Not even.
So he's no, I don't think. Well, he was actually relatively young and we're professional artillerymen. So he's got these guns, and the Australians used to complain all the time. There's Captain De Winter and his crazy gunners, they're firing days and nights. So they used to manoeuvre the guns, and I believe he just dragged them and just pulled them. He may have had either ponies or a truck to move them around. But in different parts of Dili, he would locate them and sort of range and get the crews working. So I don't think ammo was a shortage or short of ammo was a problem. But they'll come back in the story in a moment. So we know the Japanese have landed, but there was a reason why they sort of landed at the Komoros River. So they've landed on the sort of the mouth of the Komoros River, made their way up to the Komoros River, and they've met the truck coming down the hill with 7 Section. And of course, 7 Section believe they're Portuguese. They're stopped. The gunshot rings out. One of the tyres is punctured, and a sergeant jumps off the back of the truck. What are you blokes playing at? And lands and is confronted with a Japanese bayonet, soldier on the end of a bayonet. Amazed. So they're all disarmed. That whole section is disarmed. There's like 16 guys in the truck. And the Japanese, so the very annoyed Japanese, some of them weren't even soldiers, they were engineers, they were airfield engineers. So they've landed miles from there. So on the map, this is like 4 kilometres from the airfield. So why are they there? Well, again, we'll get on that with Captain De Winter. They gleefully load all their equipment into the back of the trucks, and there's not enough room in the truck. So they sort of tie together 4 of the Australian prisoners on the back of the truck, and they sort of walk behind the truck as the truck then drives along the main road, the Comoro Road, we might know it as now, the Rua de Nicola de Labato, I think it is now. It changes names a few times, but basically the road from the modern-day airport and the crossing, the bridge that crosses over the Comoro River. Those people, UN missions would know what I mean. All the way into, the lighthouse and Dili CBD.
And again, that truck drives in, they get the Japanese band up the Australians in that vehicle and put them in the tray, and then drive back into Dili city itself, or into the, you said the lighthouse before. I suppose what happens after that point once they get back to that lighthouse, and what sort of, I suppose, how does the battle unfold for that section that's on the airfield now?
Yeah, so the battle for the airfield is probably over at this stage. So we'll go back in time a bit. Around about 2 o'clock, they identify the Japanese had landed. They're put on high alert. But the first thing that happened was the Japanese invasion fleet sailed into Dili Harbour and shelled. It turned their searchlights on, identified a few key features, including the Motel Church, which still exists today, the cathedral, which is a huge building only built and opened a couple of years earlier, and then offset their guns and then shelled the Dutch headquarters and killed a whole bunch of Dutch soldiers and blew Captain Callahan out of bed, the 2IC of the Commando Company, Independent Company. He'd been down for dinner for a staff meeting with the Dutch the night before, and he got on the telephone. There was a great telephone network through Timor, so he was able to ring Mackenzie at the airfield and say, he said, put the Bren gun out on the corner. So the Mackenzie had developed, or the Australians had developed a whole heap of strong points, and they could move their weapons around according to the threat. You had 18 people, 18 soldiers. So if they landed on the beach, they'd have to be here. If they what they didn't know is the Dutch also had the whole area of the airfield, of the aerodrome, as a DF for artillery. So they were prepared to shell the Australians there if the Japanese landed there. They didn't tell the Australians that. So Mackenzie does put his machine gun there. He puts Private Fred Smith and Private Merv Ryan with their Bren gun on the road facing down towards where the truck is coming. Okay, it's still a couple more hours. So they're peering through the darkness. And what do you think they talk about? They talk about they could be the Portuguese. The Portuguese could be coming. We better make sure we sort of do the proper identification, friend or foe sort of thing. So it's gone quiet for a while. It's still a couple of hours before dawn. The shelling has ceased. Everyone's on high alert. And in fact, we know a few Japanese now infiltrating through the jungle. The classic Japanese tactic, like sending this force towards the enemy. When they hit, they sort of stop. They go out to the flanks. They go creep around the flanks. They crawl through the jungle. They pop up everywhere. They try and get it behind the enemy. Cut any telephone line you find, you cut. So before long, the phone line goes dead, and Callahan can't speak to Mackenzie. Someone's cut the telephone line, and then Callahan hears the distinctive sound of a Bren gun firing. So this is Fred Smith and Merv Ryan. Merv Ryan managed to get about 2 magazines off. What he did is during the darkness, they looked at the darkness and they see 3 ranks of troops marching down the road. And the thing is that they said they're wearing the same uniforms as the Dutch, as the Portuguese. So we said Portuguese troops in Dili. The Japanese uniform looked very similar to the Portuguese one. So what do? They wait till they get really close and they yell out to them and of course they identify them. As soon as they fire, the Japanese spread out. They start throwing grenades. One of the grenades lands in the pit. It kills Fred Smith. Badly wounds Merv Ryan. He crawls out of the trench and he goes into a monsoon drain, into the drain, which is an open sewer, and lays there wounded, badly wounded. But, the battle's on. Quite a few Japanese have been killed in this. And the Japanese immediately sort of flank out into the jungle and they make their way through and they try and cross another irrigation ditch, a long irrigation ditch, hundreds of metres long. But, it's a fire lane through the jungle up to the edge of the runway, and then the airfield is clear, largely clear for aircraft. So great fields of fire. But facing that ditch is quite thick jungle and coconuts and so on. So the Japanese jump in the ditch and try and climb up the other side, and they're met by, by Kev Curran, who went on that recon, and he actually jumps in there and bayonets about 3 Japanese and chases some of them off. But things get pretty desperate. There's a small wooden footbridge over, not far from where I lived, when I lived in Dili, and the site of it, we think we've identified where the site was. And the Japanese form up their force, and they sort of rush to, and they're going to do a banzai charge. They get together, they're all yelling. The Japanese the officers pull their swords. NCOs have swords as well, and they scream banzai and they charge across this wooden bridge. And it's like they're going to overwhelm not only the bridge, all the Australian sort of pits in the area around there, just armed with landfields, and then capture the hangar effectively. And then the idea is that they know that the airfield has been set for demolitions. But one Australian stops and steps out in the open. Joe Poynton, he's aged 20 at the time. He's private and he's got a Tommy gun. He's got an American Tommy gun, courtesy of the Americans, an old style one because the Americans are keeping the new ones they make for themselves, of course. And it's got the Bonnie and Clyde 50-round drum magazine on it, and he stops the Japanese advance. One of the accounts says Joe Poynton filled the ditch with Japanese. And they try again. They try and charge again. They're throwing grenades. He's being shot at. Accounts have bullets passing through his clothing. And again, he stands out calmly in full view of the Japanese and being shot at from all sides and stops the next charge. And that allows Lieutenant Mackenzie to give the order to withdraw. Now, in Mackenzie's little headquarters, he's got a little signal detachment of Sig Gannon with his Lucas lamp. He's able to flash his Lucas lamp up into the mountains to signal the signalers who are on picket watching and can clearly see the runway and the airfield. However, it's February, so it's wet season, and come last light, usually the clouds come in, rains, and certainly in the middle of the night, all the Australians can see up there is these sort of flashes, a bit of a rumbling. And what do? They say, that's old Captain De Winter and his artillery. Captain De Winter with his 2 old artillery pieces, his antiques that were from the gate guards at the Batavia Military College.
So they still have no idea, up in the mountains, they've still got no idea what's happening.
So the only communications they have is that heliograph, is the flashing, the Lucas lamp lights. But that message isn't getting through. Those lights are not getting through the cloud, not getting through the low cloud or the fog. And the noise is only the largest sort of naval guns from the Japanese fleet that are shelling Dili are heard, and they're rumbling. But their first sort of thought is, it must be the Dutch practicing artillery again, because he was known to practice his artillery at night. Obviously, practice all scenarios from different locations. Then it was, well, maybe it's the Portuguese firing a gun salute to welcome the fleet coming in. Because that's what you do. Naval tradition is you fire some guns. You clear your guns, don't you? So fire them off. Some of the rubbish, but it was all rubbish. Done that stuff for 100 years probably.
Yeah.
So they just convinced themselves that this must be, it must be the Portuguese, or maybe it's the Dutch, I don't know. So, but after a while, the OP or the signal OP, which is watching and the signal OPs are watching all the other platoon positions for the same Lucas lamps or the signals. And they said, go and get an officer. So it's 500 metres up, 400 metres up the hill. So they go up there, wake up and they go, what do you want? It's like, we think something's going on. He comes down and looks, a captain or a lieutenant, and goes, that's not right. No, and then he says the same things to the absolute frustration of all those around, or most of them around him. It could be the Portuguese. It might be the Dutch. It's like, for God's sake, sir, go. So he goes and gets another officer, he comes back and he goes, no. And by this time it's getting daylight. And looking through binoculars and telescopes, and they could see the uniforms on the airfield, and they go, they're Japanese. And then, to top it off, Japanese Zero aircraft circles around the airfield, clearly with its roundels on the side, clearly rising sun roundels. So the Japanese have landed. And what had happened is they'd known that only a few hours earlier, an hour earlier, they'd sent down that ration truck full of number 7 section and Lieutenant Alec Campbell's 7 section. And the thing is that he was he'd been down the town the day before in the same sort of truck, the same run. He went down with his men. But he was a bit of a deep thinker and older too. He was in his 30s, so he was always thinking about tactics and so on. So when the chance go the next day, he said, I'm not going to go down. Got a few things I need to deal with. So he didn't get on the truck. And one other fella said, I'm not going to go down. I've lost all my money gambling. They've been paid. They got their first payday. And then someone said, I'll offer to lend you some money. Oh, okay. So he runs to the truck, throws his boots in the back and jumps in the truck, and the truck drives off. So the fortunes of war, Alex Campbell is left back with only 3 members of his section. So one of the fellas that had no money and another fella just didn't want to go of his 18 or so section. So, and then he comes down, he's fretting, he can see, he's, my guys. So from the OP, they could see the truck as it crosses the river, sort of peers behind a few headlands, And
it's frustrating because there's no way to pull them back. Like you can't signal, you can't do anything, but you can see your whole section just moving down into like the Japanese advance, basically.
Yeah. So probably the next frustration is that further inland is the headquarters, and in the morning, Major Spence, the OC of the company, soon to be Lieutenant Colonel Spence, and in charge of the whole of Sparrow Force left on the island, he sends the dispatch rider goes down with his morning orders. So Private Reg Alexander gets on his motorbike and he rides up from Mauricio. So he lives at First Light, but it takes him 40 minutes to get to the Three Spurs camp, which is where this OP and where this base is. So he gets up there on his motorbike and they try and wave him down and he just waves back and keeps going. So he goes down the same, follows the truck an hour or so behind. And of course he catches up to and is killed by the Japanese.
You said killed by the Japanese, but what happens when the truck gets down there? For number 7 section, they're driving along, going down to, I presume, relieve the section down on.
No, they're going into town to have a barbecue chicken.
Yeah,
yep.
So they're thinking R&R, right?
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
What happens when they meet the Japanese?
So they meet up near the Komodo River, if not the Komodo River, very close to it. When they're captured and the Japanese put all their equipment on board, heavy equipment. The truck continues on, but 4 members are forced to walk behind, tied up, walk behind the truck. There's no room on the truck. But next second, a Dutch machine gun opens up and wounds one of the Japanese and hits the truck. And that's it. The Dutch withdraw. But the Japanese commander, Lieutenant Hondo, is incensed. And he just turns to Warnock Okamura, one of the Marines, not the naval airfield surveyors or signals. Take those 4 Australians there and shoot them. Take those 4 and execute them. And he follows orders and he says, yes, sir. So he cuts off the 4 prisoners at the back and takes them off the list and takes them off to the bush. And one of them's Keith Haynes. He's got 3 of his mates there. So Warnock Okamura gets together he wants 4 riflemen, I guess, to carry out the execution, but the Marines are confused and they're like, what are you doing? Like, so some of them refuse. So he has to use 2 riflemen to execute the 4 Australians. So he lines up the first 2 He says in his evidence later on after the war that he offered him a blindfold, or he got the sourced blindfolds because he said it was too cruel to shoot him without a blindfold. And they shoot the first two, and then they turn to Keith Hayes and his mate, and they shoot those two. So you can imagine the bolt-action rifle, and I've got a theory about this, a bolt-action rifle, you just shot someone at close range. It may be the first time they've had to do that, and you can imagine how horrible that would be. And the soldier might flinch at the idea of doing this. So they shoot the four and they bayonet them all. They bayonet Keith Hayes through the neck. He's shot in the back of the head, and they're left on the side of the road. And the truck continues on into and gets to the aerodrome, which has now been seized. Now, these soldiers are, the ones on the truck, are prisoners of the Navy, I guess. They're prisoners of the Marines or that. On the way there, a Japanese Army officer runs up to the truck and says, I need one of the Australians. So they go to the end of the rope, I guess, or I think it was telephone wire, and they pluck Private Reg Alexander, and he gets taken away. And he's thinking, I'm next, I'm going to be killed here. So he talks about it in his memoir, because he doesn't, spoiler alert, that you think your whole life's going to flash before your eyes, but I couldn't think of anything. So he's only like 19 or something. So he gets taken away, and he gets grilled by a Japanese officer. He says, I want you to take me in, take us in and show us where the Japanese consul and his family is. And he's going, what's a consul? Sort of, I don't know. But he goes, if you don't do that, I'll kill you. And there was another Japanese soldier there trying to work at Lewis gun, like they probably captured an Ambon, one of those places where Lewis guns are employed. He's trying to get the magazine on. It's like, he will kill you if you don't tell us where And he's going, I don't know. Next minute, the Japanese consul walks down the road with his family carrying suitcases. All right,
You're kidding me.
So Reg Alexander gets Peter Alexander, gets get out of jail. Reg Alexander's on the motorbike. He doesn't make it. So Peter's now taken prisoner, but he's taken prisoner by the army. It's different. So when he gets to the airfield, the Navy say, hand this guy over. And the army say, no, he's our prisoner. So he gets kept, and with a couple of other prisoners too, a couple of Australians survive. So the truck is kept at the airfield, and they talk about a church. There is a chapel near the airfield today, which has probably been there 100 years. So therefore it sort of matches up in my sort of walking the ground and trying to get some answers to what happened to these guys. But they were kept prisoners. They were seen bound and tied together in great pain, and they were kept at the airfield. And the Navy refused, Lieutenant Hondo and his crew refused to hand them over to the Army. Now, at the same time, Private Merv Ryan, who's in the ditch, he looks up and he sees Japanese troops, hundreds of troops marching over the bridge that he's under. So he crawls under the bridge. His whole lower left leg is sort of shredded from his calf, is shredded. He's now crawling through the muck. He gets to the other side. He's there for most of the day. It's blazing hot, and eventually he thinks, I'm going to die here. So he crawls out of the ditch onto the side of the road on one elbow, and he waves to the Japanese, and most of them ignore him. The next second, an officer comes over and starts to question him in English. What's your unit, where you're from, all this sort of stuff. And he goes, I have some water, and he just kept asking questions, and then sort of when he ran out of questions, he just stood up and took his pistol out and shot him and walked off. Now, it didn't kill him. The bullet went through his shoulder. He crawled back in the ditch, and some Timorese gave him some food and some water. And he stayed there for another, say, 24 hours. And eventually the Timorese picked him up and took him to the Dutch hospital in Dili, where the Dutch doctor started to treat him with a Portuguese priest as an intermediary. And the Japanese arrived at the hospital and said, we've come to occupy the hospital. And the Dutch doctor sent him away. And this is a protected place. You can't do this. And the Portuguese said, you can't do this. And the Japanese sort of went away. They come back every day and check on him, make sure the prisoners are still there. But he stayed there for about a week and recounted his story to the Portuguese priest. So you have some evidence of what happened to him.
That section, all those, that absolute massacre. But what happened to the air? So we're still pre-dawn. What happened to the airfield in that component?
Yeah, so Joe Poynton stopped the Japanese crossing that wooden footbridge in vicinity of the hangars. Mackenzie gives the order. He sees daylight's coming. They can't be caught in that withdrawal across the airfield in daylight. Big open fields of fire and so on. So he gives the order. They use that momentum, and it's again Joe Poynton and Kate Curran, Hawthorn football player. One game for Hawthorn in 1940, and then joins the army the next day.
As we record just off the oval, the Hawthorn Oval,
about 500 metres from Glenferrie Oval. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he is instrumental, Corporal Kev Curran. Now, the interesting thing about him is his brother is in the 2nd 40th at that very time, fighting a very, very similar battle. In fact, when you see the two accounts of the two brothers, one in West Timor, one in East Timor, fighting the Japanese, it's very similar, amazing. But there is a difference, which we'll get on in a moment. They fight their way across the runway. Now, when they're going across, the engineers are already in their sort of pit close to their initiation. They've got 3 pits, I think. That's my assumption. They've got 3 different initiation areas where they can initiate the electric charges. And they're waiting for the word, And Kev Cohen runs past and goes, hit it, Tex. Tex Richardson, Sapper, Corporal Tex Richardson, sorry. And so he's confused because troops are running across the airfield. Now it's daylight, they're being shot at. Now previously, Tex had seen a bloke calling towards him, and he was like, who's that over there? And he says to his Sapper, mate, look at that. There's someone over there. And next second he sees this hand moving upwards, and he realised that someone has uncovered the firing charges, the cables. So it's a Japanese infiltrator, shoots him dead. So as the Australians are running past, they're all withdrawing under, covering each other. He doesn't know what he goes. Oh, God, and he just hits the tip. He blows it up, and Kev Curran disappears in a cloud of dust. But the story is that he keeps running. He's the champion mile runner in the company. He's won the sports carnival and so on. He leaps over one of the craters. He says in his account that he just falls flat into a crater.
Yeah, good.
But he survives. They all survive, and they all successfully withdraw. Now the difference is that Sig Gannon is flashing his Lucas lamp. Now the whole time this is happening in the vicinity of the hangar, he's flashing what effectively was a car headlight up into the mountains, trying to get the attention of the signallers up in the mountains to raise the alarm. And he's being shot at the whole time. So in one account he's near the hangar, another account he's in the middle of the runway. So imagine he picks up his tripod with his light and his rifle and runs to the middle of the airfield, and he gets shot in the leg. And he's probably got a shattered femur, and all Kev Curran can do is stop and give him a drink out of his water bottle, but they have to leave him on the runway, so he's left there. And Lieutenant McKenzie gets everyone into their sort of RV on the other side of the runway. A messenger had gone back a couple of times on a push bike, between Callaghan and McKenzie, trying to pass messages on, riding his bike through the middle of the Japanese in one case. But they get to their RV and then they sort of scatter and make their way up to the RVs up into the mountains, and they clash with the Japanese. And again, Joe Poynton saves the day. In the middle of an ambush, he steps out, throws grenades like 40, 50 metres into a Japanese machine gun post. So again, distinguishes himself. But effectively, the Australians have now vacated the airdrome. All the other forces are up in the mountains, and the 7 section has been captured and subsequently be executed on the runway. Now, the question is, why didn't the Japanese land? And they intended to land at the runway, at the airdrome, on the beach, which is a beach today. And what we know is that Lieutenant De Winter and his artillery were located near the lighthouse where the road ended back in the day. And he fires his pathetic little artillery. They're probably 6-inch guns, breech loaders, and all the rounds land short. So the Japanese get closer because this little piddly pea shooters. Well, he's a wily old dog, De Winter. He was aiming low deliberately, and when the Japanese get close enough, he raises his elevation and hits one of the vessels and sets it on fire. And that forces the Japanese to then relocate and land their troops. They put some troops ashore, apparently, in boats, and the Dutch machine gunners open up. And apparently it's a massacre. One of the accounts of the Dutch Bronze Cross for gallantry for both De Winter and the machine gunners have them causing severe casualties of the Japanese landing on the beach. So that initial force landed there, but the rest of the follow-on force, those engineers and those surveyors and those signallers, which you could imagine wouldn't be in the first wave, go another 3 or 4 kilometres away to further to the west. And they land at the Komoro River, and that, unfortunately, is the intersection between 7 section coming down the mountain and the Japanese coming up the Komoro River. So that's pretty much the end of the battle. The Dutch, they had a battle plan. Colonel Van Straten was the head of military tactics at the same Batavian military college. He had a plan. There's all moving parts, infantry, QRF and so on. He says, let's go, back to West Timor. Packs up his headquarters and heads over the Bakura Hills, over towards Hera, and up into the mountains.
That's the end of the Dutch.
That's the end of the Dutch. There was no real other resistance, so they just evacuated immediately. And the thing is that he didn't leave. He actually went up the mountains and met up with the Australians, and he stayed for another couple of months before he was evacuated back to Australia from a Catalina flying boat, which evacuated some Australian wounded, including one prominent person we're about to touch on in a moment. So
yeah, that's what I was just about to say. We introduced Keith Hayes into this component and talk about his story because it was absolutely fascinating. But sort of, so we're off the aerodrome, Dutch have left, and we're getting ready again and now we're mounting a guerrilla campaign up in the hills. I suppose what happens next?
Well, the first thing in the case of Keith Hayes, who had been taken away for the four and executed on the side of the road, was that evening is that Keith Hayes wakes up. So he's suffered terrible wounds, shot in the back of the head. It's quite graphic. They talk about people saying it was like, it must have been quite, I think you've seen the demonstration. They fire a blank into a bucket of water or a blank into off a can of Coke or something that shatters it, just blows it out. So my theory is that the soldier that shot the first Australian got a very rude experience. It probably shot him in the back of the head and it was very graphic and might have been covered with his brains and blood and so on. And he's then worked the bolt of his rifle and gone to shoot Keith, and maybe he's just flinched a bit, shut one eye. But he hasn't shot Keith in the head. It's passed through the back of his sort of neck and exited out of his jaw or his cheek. And then the bayonet wounds have just gone into his shoulder and through his neck, but didn't kill him. So when he's woken up, some Timorese boys have found him, and they take him to the house of a Timorese woman who's been abandoned by her husband. And she, at great risk to her own life, takes him in, hides him in a pile of wood out the back and cares for him. Uses some questionable sort of medical knowledge, putting a mud pack on his open wounds and banana leaves, but basically cares for him, gives him food and water, but critically gets the Timorese boys to send a message up in the mountains to tell the Australians that one of their boys is here. And she looks after him long enough for him to be rolled up in a rug, variously rolled up in a rug and buried under firewood, hidden, at great risk to her own life. And eventually he gets draped over a horse, a pony, and again wrapped in a rug and disguised and taken up through the Japanese lines up in the mountains and to the famous Dr. Dunkley, who treats his wounds. And Dr. Dunkley even says in his accounts, he was shocked at the wounds. And amazingly for Keith, Dr. Dunkley, so extended patient care. We often talk about the golden hour, don't we, and all that sort of stuff. But here we are talking about soldiers who were badly wounded, suffering from malaria for weeks, crippled, and he's caring for their wounds with the minimum amount of equipment. A lot of their medical equipment was abandoned. He had his medical section, so a lot of orderlies, but also carrying stretchers in the dark, using Timorese guides in the middle of nowhere, no maps, going from place to place to try and keep up with his medical section and the little RAP having to move occasionally to protect itself from Japanese attack. Incredible story. And not long after, less than a week later, as another Australian soldier, Private Hollows, is shot in the face and loses his entire lower jaw. His entire bottom jaw was blown away. He staggers up the path past his mates who are certain he'll die. But they put him on a stretcher anyway, carry him through again, led by Timorese, through the middle. They don't know where they are. One of the Australians holds his hand the whole time. And eventually, both Private Hollows and Private Hayes are evacuated on a Catalina flying boat from the south coast, along with Colonel Van Straten and Brigadier Veal and from Sparrow Force. And Lieutenant Colonel Spence becomes the commander of Sparrow Force, gets promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, and Captain Callahan becomes Major Callahan and is now the commander of the 2nd Independent Company. And on a side note, that Catalina is piloted by an American airman, naval airman, who went on to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and during the Vietnam War. So it was basically the top American general during the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s.
When you talked about, I think, your initial episode with INTERFET and then subsequently this one with Keith, or the story with Keith, but more broadly sown throughout, is that support from the locals. Like that, we couldn't have done it without them, I don't think, and to risk to come in as Australians and be completely supported by the Timorese against the Japanese as the Japanese are inspecting, and building up their presence in Dili. We couldn't have done it without them, I presume.
Absolutely not. And we haven't touched on the Tasmanians at Second 40, but their experience with the Timorese effectively, but the Dutch Timorese is completely different. And there's a different sort of feel for independence, independence movements from decolonisation and so on in the Dutch and Portuguese sides. I mean, I don't think the Portuguese are any better, but maybe the Dutch were seen to be more brutal or something. Or maybe people like Sukarno embrace the Japanese occupation for the same reason the Japanese want them to. We're all under that co-prosperity sphere. You're now part of this great thing. Of all you have your independence, and now you can work with us, and it's going to be great. And they saw that as a way of being able to get rid of the Dutch colonisers, and maybe the Portuguese or the Timorese felt the same, but it just didn't seem to be the same. And certainly at that level, there was great support. And maybe that was back to, again, how the Australians conducted themselves when they first arrived in Portuguese Timor. Now, maybe they set the seeds and they set those friendships and those relationships, and they started to learn that language, and they started to know the terrain. One comment from the Timorese was, what was different about the Australians? And this is like years later, someone in the 70s or 80s, I think, interviewed the Timorese gentleman, and he said the difference between the Australians and the Japanese is that they never touched our women. So it was sort of maybe a sense of respect or honour or something like that. I know that Australians can be dirtbags and ratbags and all that sort of stuff, but that was the perception anyway. And then what happened was, in those weeks afterwards, was all this support came out of these villages. People saw the Japanese as invaders, even though, they didn't have a particular love for the Portuguese, I think. But the Australians started to find themselves, like early in the morning, they'd find a small, literally a Timorese boy cooking a meal, next to them. And then during the day, they'd sort of tap them on the leg and say, I'll carry your backpack, hand signals. And then it turned into this thing where in the end, every Australian soldier had a criado, which is a loose term for servant, maybe a man boy or a garçon in the French. Today it's a bit offensive, but it's probably like a helper, a Timorese helper. And these criados were anywhere from, in one case of this Chinese Timorese boy, Akio, he was only 9 years old when he was wounded by the Japanese and refused to denounce the Australians and was left for dead, attacked again and left for dead, slashed across the neck, had his ears cut off, or one ear cut off. Besides him being, in this case of Akio being nursed back to health by Dr. Dunkley, was every Australian had these Timorese boys anywhere from age 9 to say 14, and then some of the senior officers had older chaps who were, maybe village headmen, sons of village headmen or relatives, nephews and nieces, or nephews and so on. And they acted as guides, they sourced food, they carried equipment, and in some cases they fought with the Australians. In many cases the Australians would shoo away their criados, take their packs and webbing, and heavy equipment and go, and we'll meet up with you after they had a plan to RV with them. And they turn around and they'll still be, what are you doing here, sort of thing. And in some cases, Australians would be wounded and the criados would rush forward to pick up the Australian and grab the Bren gun. And there's one case where the Timorese guy grabbed the barrel and burned himself quite badly because he'd never done it before. They went back and rescued the Bren gun and got the Bren gun, the vital Bren gun out. And this was the case across all of the, and when the second independent company were relieved by the second, fourth independent company, this is one of their lessons learned. You have a criado, you have these sort of Timorese helpers. And, if in time of crisis, if they need to go, they'll go back to their village. Some shot through, others would go forward into the village. They know the village or they know someone. They'd go off ahead and come back half an hour later. It's all clear. Japanese were here yesterday, that sort of stuff. And they did so willingly. Other cases in West Timor with the Dutch Timorese was paid cases where you could, if you had money, you could bribe, or people were swapping their watches and so on because they just didn't trust or they weren't sure what reception they got. And there wasn't a lot of cases there. There was many cases where the Australians would offer something and get a rebuttal, no, or they'd do an IOU. So there's all these IOUs getting around. And when eventually a big case, 500 kilo sort of tub of silver coins arrived from one of the resupply ships that were established, and they paid out all their IOUs. They paid all the horse handlers that were the pony trains that took all the supplies from the beachhead out to the platoons. And that's an amazing story. And without any of that, the Australians would not, the guerrilla campaign would not have succeeded, or would not have lasted as long as it did without the support of the Timorese, but the support of the local population, for sure.
I suppose that's the Timorese support that and you made the argument that we couldn't have done it without them, I suppose. And that, I suppose, going into a location, not just starting your recon and getting out the lay of the land and stuff, but also getting that support of the local population, both your INTERFET example and World War II, both I suppose that sort of, you can hear that throughout that entire, both experiences. Now, if we go back up into the mountains and we're starting to, the rest of the company is starting to mount that guerrilla campaign, what happens with that force that's up in the hills?
So it's about a week after the invasion, and the platoons are just getting word now. They're getting word that Singapore's fallen, for example. One of the platoons finds out from listening to a Dutch language radio broadcast that someone translates for them, and they're shocked to find out that 2 weeks earlier Singapore was fallen. So they're just starting to find out what's going on. They start to get these messages coming in by runner saying, yep, Dili's been captured, we're up in the mountains, and they actually start to pull the commanders in. They walk these long distances in, and they have these conferences, and they go back out and tell the platoons what to do. And this is the first time the Japanese start to leave Dili. They start to go out and they start to clash with the Australians. And some of these first clashes are quite amateur. They try to ambush some trucks. The charges don't go off. The section commander steps out in the middle of the road with his Tommy gun and it fails to fire. And it's a bit, but Callahan in particular says just be aggressive. So at every opportunity hit the Japanese, and some of them are like pathological, hatred for the Japanese or whatever. They went out of their way, cover long distances by day and night to try and get in a position to have a go. But after a while, they sort of settle. I guess both forces settle. The Japanese move their invasion fleet out. They only landed a battalion in Dili because that's all they considered they needed for the problem. It was a neutral territory. The Australian force was small. The airfield needed a lot of repairs, and of course they started to build their runway. And this is critical. They build the runway and they start using the port, which is their intent. Now they're closer to, and they started to build another airfield further east as well, and that's very close to Darwin. So it's able to influence air operations out of Darwin. By now the Australians and the Japanese start to clash in the mountain, and the Australians start to have some big successes, and they get bolder and more inventive in the way they do it. And of course, always with their Crowdos, always with their Timorese guides. The Australians are forced to blow up their cache of explosives and ammunition. And when the explosion went off, Peter Alexander's a prisoner carrying sacks of rice up to a Japanese position, and he says the Japanese were just petrified. They all just leapt into the ditch. They didn't know what to do. People were running everywhere issuing orders because they thought it was an attack. They didn't realise it was just a case. But this is there's something like 30 tonnes worth of equipment and stores just blowing up. And the engineers were quite upset because they're blowing up their own stuff. But they took away as much as they could on ponies and by hand, grenades and weapons and so on. And the guerrilla war, as we know, probably starts. But the first problem the Australians have, the immediate problem is food, and this is a theme throughout. They're always looking for food. They spend most of their time looking for food. When they get to the next location, they've got to impose themselves on the Timorese. And of course, the Japanese are doing the same thing. Sometimes the Japanese would come in and the Timorese would say, initially the Japanese paid for things and then they promised to pay for things and they just came in and took it. And the Australians always sort of promised, or, they try to keep that relationship. And Callahan was pretty strict on that. Don't touch the women, pay for the things you used, IOUs. And then they used those sacks of silver coins to repay them. And this sort of battle continued for a while. A garrison battalion came in, and that again tried these punitive sort of measures into the highlands to try and find those Australians who were a bit too elusive, well connected, and they could easily observe the Japanese columns moving around. But they didn't have any communications the whole time. Sparrow Force, according to Canberra and Australia, had been like Ambon, like Gulf Force, like Lark Force in Withdrawal, been cut off and destroyed. And that was the assumption. The thing is that the commandos in the 2nd Independent Company only had communications back to Kupang, their higher headquarters at Sparrow Force. So when Sparrow Force was destroyed, effectively the Australians didn't have any radios. And one of the signallers who worked for the ABC before the war in Hobart, he started to accumulate parts of radios, and they actually sent on foot some guys to go all the way from Dili to Atambua, if you know where it is, on foot. Going through the mountains, they went to a place where they know that the higher Sparrow Force headquarters had destroyed some radios when they thought they were going to be captured. So when they got the sort of the every man for himself sort of order, they just destroyed all their gear. Well, they went through the fire, found all this solder and items and just brought them back. And he said, yeah, I can use these. So they cobbled together a radio called Winnie the War Winner, not named for Winston Churchill, but named for a cartoon character. And they were eventually able to contact Australia. They used old codes, but on the other end of the radio, the operator said, he started a name, are you with such and such? Where does he live? What's his wife's name? And they used sort of like veiled speech to be able to elicit that they were Australians and they weren't under duress. So from there, supplies were flowing in, extra radios, codes and equipment, and the first sort of, the message was force intact and still fighting, need Tommy gun, ammunition, boots and quinine for the malaria. Malaria. So, and that started that process of that aerial resupply first, and then eventually the Dili Express between Dili and Darwin, ships coming to the south coast. So the Australians by that stage were on the south coast and moved up the mountains and then had that process of landing at Batano. Now, after a few months of malaria and dengue and poor food and so on, the Australians were exhausted, so they were the 2nd, 4th Independent Company is designated as Lancer Force to come in and relieve the second, by this stage, the 2nd Commando Company. And disaster struck when that former member of the Scrap Iron Flotilla in the Mediterranean, the old Australian destroyer, HMAS Voyager, runs aground at Batano and can't be shifted, and eventually is scuttled and then destroyed by Japanese aerial bombing. But they unload everything off it. One of the sailors, his brother's in Sparrow Force, he hears about it, so he heads off in the bush, finds him, and they give him a uniform and he fights alongside his brother. So he's reported as AWOL, missing, variously deserted or whatever from the Royal Australian Navy. When he gets back to Australia, he continues fighting with the Army, and when he's at the end of World War II, he has to discharge from the Navy and the Army because he's still in both.
That's the right kind of service transfer from Navy to Army, you know what I mean? Into the, yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and you only got to learn a few guns and, camp up or whatever.
Yeah.
Put a tin hat on and he gets permission to fight with his brother.
Yeah.
So the sailors were evacuated, and now what happened, though, effectively, is the force doubles. Second was supposed to withdraw, and now they're trapped with second, fourth. So what they did is they just doubled the force. A platoon went out with A platoon, B platoon, and so on, C and D. And they went out to those locations, double the force. They had to share the food, though, if you can imagine. So it was like, we got all these extra guys, but they're also they're really hungry. These second, fourth guys are really hungry. But the idea was that they'd fight left seat, right seat, and eventually withdraw. But they didn't. They fought side by side. So the Japanese now did some really, firstly punitive and then, but real aggressive thrusts. They used aircraft to spot. So up in those areas, those mountainous areas where the vegetation's quite thin, they were able to use the aircraft to signal down to the Japanese forces to direct them where to go. And it became quite difficult. The Australians found it quite difficult to evade the Japanese. And a few times they were right on the ropes. It was about to be, if they were convinced they were last stand sort of stuff. There's nowhere to go. We're strapped against the mountains. And next second, the Japanese had gone. And when they followed them up, they found the entire column just making their way back to Dili. They just basically reached the end of their logistics or their timeline or whatever. Now, importantly, though, is that garrison division or those divisions that were there could have been used somewhere else. So the 48th Division, all these other forces, like the ones that invaded Timor, had been used in Borneo, had been used in Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Java, and China, and variations of it. They sort of flip-flopped and pepper-potted and leapfrogged each other down in their various invasion forces. So many of them ended up, that same invasion force in Timor, then landed in Timor, ended up in Papua and New Guinea, ended up in the Solomons, and then eventually ended up in places like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, where almost all of them were destroyed. The whole divisions were destroyed. The ones that survived were generally those who were wounded and sent back to Japan and maybe not recommitted or maybe given light duties or corps transfer. So around that time, that June-July period where Kokoda is at its sort of zenith and before Milne Bay, those Japanese forces were trapped in Timor, effectively trying to hunt down and destroy this guerrilla group of Sparrow Force.
So they're still bogging those Japanese forces down. Like we've got both commando companies in East Timor trying this. It's still being identified by Japanese aircraft, finding it incredibly difficult to stay hidden, but still occupying and bogging down that Japanese force so that they can't be committed anywhere else on the battlefield.
Yep, and every time the Japanese made that move, they were able to. The Australians were able to intercept them, to ambush them. Bren gun ambush. They come in one time with 12 Bren guns, crept in the middle of the night, positioned themselves above the Japanese garrison in Malbisi, and just opened fire on their accommodation. And just killed dozens but scared the living bejesus out of them. So, and the whole time supported ably by the Air Force. The Hudson bombers in particular featured all the way through it. Hudson bombers dropping supplies, bombing Dili Harbour, bombing various posts, like Ballabo. So Ballabo fought that most Australian soldiers who served in that UN INTERFET peacekeeping times would know that the Mitchell bombers, the Dutch East Indies, number 18 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, Dutch Australian Squadron, came up the coast from Batagade and bombed the Posada, the fort at Ballabo, and destroyed the building. And all of those posts, where the Australians would report where the Japanese were and radio messages back to Darwin and then ably supported by probably dozens, especially the ships like HMAS Castlemaine, which is here in Melbourne, alongside Gem Pier in Williamstown as a museum ship. But those HMAS Armidale lost off the south coast of Timor, trying to reinforce Dutch troops onto Timor, and the subsequent awarding of the Victoria Cross to Teddy Sheen. That without the Navy and the Air Force flying those missions. And it's interesting because General MacArthur said, keep those Australians there, don't withdraw them. And then General Blamey said, good, so give us some of your air forces to be able to support them. So the Americans begrudgingly, if you look at the map where the Americans were bombing things and doing things, there's this little sideshow where they went over to Timor every so often. But their main effort, especially MacArthur, was on the Philippines. He wanted the Philippines back. He said that he would. But of course it was a former American colony, and they had close relationships with the Philippines. So Borneo was a sideshow. Bougainville was nothing. Solomons was something they had to do. But Timor was also something, had to do it, because he was sort of, you want them there, you want those, you've got to support them. And we, Australia and the Dutch, can't do it ourselves. So the Dutch provided ships. And in fact, eventually, Lancer Force is withdrawn almost a year after the Japanese landing in Dili and Kupang. They're finally withdrawn. And one of the ships that takes them off is a Dutch destroyer.
That's absolutely awesome. I think that's an excellent place to leave the episode. So obviously, you talked about at the start of the episode, a Portuguese naval transport arriving in Dili, which turned out to be the Japanese. And then we spoke about a number of different ambushes, sending that section mounted in the back of the truck for a R&R with their section commander staying back and them not being able to signal the fact that they were just driving straight into the Japanese. Massacres down on the airfield and then subsequently mounting a guerrilla campaign to bog those Japanese down in East Timor that would have otherwise been occupied somewhere else in the battlefield. Thank you so much for your time, sir. That is absolutely awesome. Thank you.
No problems.
Just before we end the episode, I think it's important to acknowledge the actions of those contained within this episode and those that defended against the Japanese landings and the initial defence on the Dili Aerodrome. The Military Cross was awarded to Lieutenant Jerry Mackenzie for his leadership in the delaying action at the aerodrome. The Distinguished Conduct Medal was given to Private Joy Poynton for stopping the Japanese Banzai charges across the footbridge near the aerodrome hangars and forcing through the Japanese roadblock later that same day. The Dutch artillery officer that we spoke about, Captain de Winter, was awarded the Dutch Bronze Cross. Mackenzie and Poynton were also recognised with this by the Dutch government. Nominated for the Military Cross but downgraded to a mention in dispatch for his service on Timor was World War I veteran Dr. Captain Roger Dunkley. After being evacuated by Catalina flying boat in May 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Nico van Straten was awarded the Military Order of William 4th Class, which, despite its misleading class, is actually the Dutch Victoria Cross equivalent and the Netherlands' highest award for valour in battle. He is one of only 199 people given this award since 1940. There is a link to Major Warnock's time in Afghanistan in this particular decoration. During his second tour in 2006, that was the first time the Military Order of William was awarded since the Korean War to the then Lieutenant Marco Kroon of the Dutch Special Forces Task Force 77 Viper or Corps Commando Troepen. Task Force 66, SASR and Commando Force elements worked closely with Task Force 77 on many joint operations. Lastly, Private Keith Payne was awarded the OAM for his services to the East Timor community. He died on 23rd of August 2018, aged 97. He was one of the last survivors of Sparrow Force to die.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.